Our next presenters will focus on diagnostics. We're lucky to have a number of leading diagnostic companies right here in the state of Utah. Diagnostics are fundamental to quality healthcare, and increasingly, diagnostics drive the right treatment for the right patient at the right time. In this session, Andrea Kendell, CFO and Senior Vice President at bioMérieux, will talk with Nicole Lambert, immediate past COO and former president of Myriad Genetics, to explore the diagnostic landscape and what lies ahead. We've already introduced Andrea, so a word about Nicole before we begin. Nicole joined Myriad Genetics in June of 2001, and until last week, supervised the company's laboratory operations along with the oncology, women's health, and international business units. Prior to joining Myriad Genetics, she was a practicing certified genetic counselor at LabCorp in the Houston Medical Center. Nicole calls herself a previvor, someone with a predisposition to cancer, and in this case, breast cancer, but with the tools to mitigate her risk. Given that breast cancer ran in her family, with the advent of Myriad's BRCA genetic testing, Nicole has been able to make healthcare decisions based on data rather than fear. She's an inspiration to women everywhere. Nicole received her bachelor's degree in biology and sociology from Boston College and earned a master's degree in genetic counseling from the Mount Sinai School of Medicine at New York University. She also serves as a member of the board of directors of Arcus Bioscience. Please join me in welcoming Andrea and Nicole to the stage.
Good morning. We are almost to lunch, so we will make sure we're not standing in the way of people getting lunch. So we're happy to be here. I'll let Nicole start by talking a bit about Myriad Genetics and her role in Myriad Genetics and the difference that Myriad Genetics has made in the Utah community, but also globally as a really important diagnostics company.
Sure, absolutely. I think many of you in Utah are familiar with Myriad Genetics. I started with the company 22 years ago, and we were a $16 million company, very early stage. We were marketing BRCA analysis, testing for BRCA1 and BRCA2. And before COVID, we were an $851 million company, and we had diversified into women's health and oncology and mental health and autoimmune diseases and research and dermatology, and we had expanded our footprint globally to have a production facility in Cologne and an office in Tokyo, and really became a global company from there. So we grew up from the very early stages of discovering that science at the University of Utah and attracting venture capital money to becoming really a very large biotech company here in Utah. And I know we were just talking before the session too that you had an interesting journey yourself with BioFire and coming into a global company and growing that way. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your journey as well.
Okay. So, Nicole, there's a lot of similarities and exchange between Nicole and I. Myriad Genetics in Research Park, started in Research Park. Idaho Technologies turned into BioFire Diagnostics, and now bioMérieux. Started in Idaho, but really had developed its roots in the park. So we've both lived in organizations in Research Park for many years, and both companies had technology that came out of the University of Utah, which is really exciting. So it really is. Our roots are here. The team members that are part of our organizations are proud to be part of very large and meaningful companies in the Utah community. BioFire Diagnostics and Idaho Technologies were founded by founders who are still part of the Utah-based community. One of the founders came out of the University of Utah and ran a lab in University of Utah for many years. I joined BioFire in 2013 when it was right on the brink of starting into the foyer of commercial diagnostics, starting with a platform focused on respiratory diagnostics. We're in the infectious disease diagnostic space. And it's been, a really exciting ride since then. We've continued to expand the platform into a lot of different diagnostic tests, ranging from lower and upper respiratory disease, meningitis, encephalitis, blood culture, ID, and gastrointestinal. So it's been an exciting opportunity, working with a lot of great people over the years, and now being part of bioMérieux, which has got a global footprint, and watching the company and the product and the franchise expand and have a reach that is exciting to be a part of today. So, Nicole, why don't you start by talking a bit about diagnostics, the evolution of diagnostics for Myriad. What started Myriad, and how have you expanded, and what does the reach look like in terms of patient care and diagnoses of a lot of different cancer treatments today and early diagnosis?
Sure. I think we've come a really long way in 22 years. And, some of that was driven by innovation on our side, and some of it was really driven by patient demand and what patients were looking for in testing. Being a genetic counselor before I came to Myriad, I remember the days at Mount Sinai where, very few patients came in for BRCA testing. And when they did, they came into the academic medical center, they met with a genetic counselor for 2 hours before they went through the blood testing, and even the insurance verification process was long. They sent in their insurance information first, and then we pre-authorized everything. Some patients wanted to be tested anonymously because they were afraid of insurance discrimination, so they would just try to pay cash or even take out a loan or something to try to pay for testing. And then the testing itself would take 4 or 5 weeks, and so there'd be a lot of anxiety about that. And also, the patients that came in, you saw these really striking family histories where 6 or 7 people had breast cancer. Several people died of ovarian cancer. Like there were these, we would sit and draw these pedigrees where everyone was affected, and it was obvious that something was going on in that family. And then they would get the results back. They would come back and meet with a genetic counselor for an hour. They would go through the results. Sometimes they would bring family members back into the medical center, and we'd all sit down together and talk about the results. It was a very time-consuming and laborious process, but also I think kind of based on the research paradigm or the academic paradigm of delivery of care. Whereas, you fast forward now, and even I think the pandemic really accelerated this, that, patients are more comfortable with genetic information. They want that information. They want to get it straight from their OB-GYN or their surgeon or oncologist that they're already seeing. Or you have patients that were newly diagnosed with breast cancer, and they're trying to use this information to decide on either surgery or chemotherapy. So they need the results back not in 5 weeks. They need the results back in under 10 days, a lot of times, to make a surgical decision. And then they want those results right away. So things changed in the ecosystem in terms of what patients wanted. I think physician comfort as well. In the early days, your community practicing breast surgeon just was not comfortable talking about genetic testing information with their patients, and now they're much, much more comfortable. The breast surgeons feel like, well, I need this test result to plan surgery, so I'm going to order the test, and we're going to plan the right surgery, and they're going to be in the OR in 10 days. Or you have community medical oncologists saying, I need to know if this patient's eligible for a PARP inhibitor, so I need this test result as soon as possible. We've come a long way with payer guidelines, with insurance reimbursement. Now it used to be these long letters of medical necessity to try to get insurance to pay for it. Now most insurance companies cover it, but also have very straightforward criteria. Immediately when a patient's test comes in the door, that they qualify, that they'll get coverage, and you can start running their test immediately. It took us a long time, and I think a lot of Lean Six Sigma interventions to get our turnaround time from 5 weeks to 8 days, which is about where we are now. And so that was a huge upgrade. And FDA regulation. When we started 22 years ago, this was a laboratory developed test, and we ran it with all the quality controls that would go by CLIA and CAP. But as this became a companion diagnostic, as we went through that FDA approval process, there was a different level of regulation and scrutiny. But I think, we did very well with it. We had a very collaborative relationship with the FDA, and we're able to get BRCA through the FDA approval process, and that's been a wonderful experience as well, which I know those regulations are changing. Most of genetic testing may go through FDA regulation at some point in time, but we're in a really, really different place than we were when I started 22 years ago.
Yeah. What do you think helped Myriad Genetics raise awareness and get closer to the patient so patients knew what to ask for? Because that, you described it a little, but if you don't know that there are tests and early diagnosis out there, what did you do to get closer to the patient and raise the awareness of the diagnostics solutions that you have, and empower the patient to start asking for these tests?
Yeah, that also was a long journey, right? Because it used to be, if you were getting care at Sloan Kettering, that might be something that was offered to you. But for a patient who maybe didn't have cancer yet themselves, but they had a strong family history, could they go into their OB-GYN and ask for this? And oftentimes in the beginning too, even if a patient did that, their OB-GYN might say, I don't know if you want to do that. That information might be scary, or it might not, your insurance company might not cover it, or there was a lot of misinformation and a lot of fear out there. And that's part of how I started with Myriad. Myriad hired a number of genetic counselors in the industry to go out and educate physicians about it. We were the first genetic testing company to do, direct-to-consumer advertising. We had television commercials, which were highly controversial at the time. Now seems, again, very routine. You see 23andMe is, advertising a Christmas special on Amazon, right? It's a very different space than where we were years ago. And I think working with, guideline committee members to make sure that professional societies supported patients getting testing, and that we were marketing to those target patients and being sort of responsible in the way that we marketed and advertised testing.
Great, thank you. So along with Myriad and bioMérieux, we want to take a second to just acknowledge a lot of other fantastic diagnostic companies in our Utah ecosystem. In the park with us is ARUP, which has been around for a very long time, and one of the, I think, number 3 in reference labs. We have Co-Diagnostics, Seek Labs, Quansis Bioscience, bioMérieux, who I am a part of, Renalytics AI, Sarah Prognostics, Solution DX, Inherent Biosciences, Ionic, Pathos, Nanospot, Spectrum, Echelon, Cytech, Nelson, and that's just to name a few of the really credible companies that started their roots here or made their way here and have grown the Utah life sciences and diagnostic space and employ a lot of fantastic people. So maybe if we switch gears a little bit, why don't we talk about global footprint for Myriad, because that's been a really big evolution.
Sure, absolutely. And it really does teach you a lot about the way that genetic services are offered to patients, are regulated, are reimbursed in different ways around the globe. So we learned a lot about that, and I'd love to hear your perspective as well, because bioMérieux had a different journey than we did. We started out as a US company and then expanded into first Europe and then Asia, primarily Japan, which is where most of our Asian business comes from today. And I would say you just see a really different cycle of how diagnostics come to market, how they are regulated, how they are reimbursed. In the US, again, when we first launched, we were under an LDT model, and there's a very long sort of selling cycle between when you launch a test and when U.S. Payers will pay for it, right? And the U.S. healthcare system is fragmented. We're not a single payer system. And so there's a constant back and forth with different payers to say, okay, your large public payers are going to want this in order to cover the test. Your private payers might want a totally different sort of dossier to understand what coverage would look like in that environment. And then you might have, your state Medicaids or other payers that might want a completely different set of criteria by which they make decisions for coverage. What we found when we went into the EU is that cycle was very, 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 very long. And so, products that we consider sort of, standard of care and BRCA-analysis, BRCA1 and 2 testing. That's a test that's been on the market for 30 years in the U.S. and is very well covered. In Europe, there are still a lot of places where it's not covered or it's not offered to patients or it's only offered to a very select group of patients. It's a very long cycle to get reimbursement in those countries. And so you don't often see the same utilization that you might see in the U.S. Japan has a really different paradigm in that the regulatory approval and the reimbursement come fairly simultaneously. And so as the regulators look at the scientific data behind, for instance, our BRCA-analysis companion diagnostic product, once PMDA approved it, it's a very short cycle for the payer environment, the Japanese payer, to pay for it. And also you see, the way that physicians use it is that, once it gets that regulatory and reimbursement approval and the data has been presented, the uptake from physicians is very, very quick. They move from, something being declared, approved and reimbursed to full adoption in, less than a year. I mean, there's a very quick uptake once you go through that process. Whereas, as we look at adherence to NCCN guidelines in the U.S., we're maybe 60% or so. You still see a lot of patients that would meet criteria for testing, would have coverage for testing, and are not getting testing in the U.S. and even further behind, I think, in Europe. But for us, we're a U.S.-based company. We had to go into these markets and try to figure it out. Mm-hmm. bioMérieux had a different journey, being a U.S. company and being acquired by a company that already knew how to operate in Europe. So I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yes. So BioFire bioMérieux started as a U.S.-based company, and we had access into markets outside of the U.S. through distribution relationships. And those grew as the platform and the awareness, the brand awareness, and our success started to take hold in the U.S. But with the acquisition of bioMérieux and bioMérieux having commercial subsidiaries in over 42 different countries, that really was the gateway for us to introduce the products globally. But it wasn't an automatic. We had to start the process of the regulatory hurdles, identifying the markets that were going to be most fruitful to initially invest in those regulatory activities, and establishing ourselves in the global footprint. So step by step, country by country, getting our CE marking. And starting to be in that space, and then learning how to navigate the regulatory environment in Asia Pacific, in Japan, in China, which are incredibly long and challenging to get into. But we had the fortunate ability to leverage the footprint that bioMérieux had established, but had to really develop an awareness. Molecular diagnostics, it took a very long time for the healthcare space to embrace the concept of molecular diagnostics, and really PCR and the PCR technology was not something that was really well known or understood, and COVID, frankly, is what really expanded and changed the vernacular around molecular diagnostics. And you hear people, normal people who aren't part of a diagnostics-based company, talking about PCR technology because they learned and understood what it meant as a result of the pandemic, and they learned and understood the value of molecular diagnostics and what it could do for patient care in terms of time to result, highly accurate, highly sensitive, really reliable testing. So that, COVID was an opportunity to really showcase the companies who'd been working for quite some time in molecular diagnostic space and working to educate and embrace the technology in large hospital footprint. And then over the same time, of course, we're growing the testing on the platform, which also helped, starting to get into other parts of diagnostics through our GI test. We used to call it our poop panel, which is exciting when you're in diagnostics and you're doing things like talking about gastrointestinal and diarrhea and women's health and all these things that become part of your everyday discussion, and outside of that people look at you like you're crazy when you say things. But the global opportunity has been a good journey, I think, and frankly, bioMérieux, the acquisition of BioFire by bioMérieux was really what was the jumping point for our ability to take the product and go global, and an excellent team, a regulatory team who built an incredible relationship with the FDA. And being one of the early to market molecular diagnostics companies, the FDA really looked a lot and still does look a lot to bioMérieux about what we are doing with molecular testing in the space, and post-COVID, what we are doing to get closer to the patient and closer to patient care. And that's where the market is going. And consumers are being more educated and more empowered to take their own health journey on in a way that they weren't willing to before, or were really comfortable. But companies like Myriad and bioMérieux and many others that I listed, and many others in the room here, are helping raise the level of awareness for patient and to be, kind of steer your own ship when it comes to the healthcare and the testing and the kind of tests and companies and technology patients want to align themselves with. So let's talk a little bit more about reimbursement, because it is one of the big obstacles. I know it is for bioMérieux, and market access and an understanding of the reimbursement landscape, and especially with a lot of other competing technology in the space, and understanding how you fit. Maybe share a little bit with the audience what Myriad had to do to understand reimbursement, market access, payer coverage. What did that look like? What kind of expertise did you have to bring to bear in-house and externally to understand and navigate those waters?
Yeah, and that probably is the number one challenge, right? If you can't get paid, everything else sort of comes to full stop. And so, and definitely the paradigm, I think, in diagnostics, right, is, start with data, right? You have to have clinical data, you have to have the clinical validation for your test, you have to have the analytical validation for your test, and then really going into professional society guidelines, right? Whether that's NCCN guidelines in the cancer space, or, whether that's ACOG or whichever professional society you're dealing with, when they support the use of a certain test, or they feel like there are certain patient populations that can benefit from that diagnostic test, then payers, typically will come on board. And so you'll see a spectrum of payers, obviously. In the United States, Medicare has been a fairly good early adopter of some of the diagnostic tests, with the promise that they help to ensure better outcomes, better care, and cost effectiveness of care in the United States. Then you typically move into those private payers, and there'll be a spectrum of adoption, right? And the Blues plans often will do a technical assessment. They'll have an evidence evaluation of the studies that you have, and then you'll move into the sort of later adopting payers. And so, with Medicare, the process is much more transparent. You sort of know what you need to do, the studies that they are going to look for with respect to analytical validation, clinical utility. You go through the MolDX program, there's a comment period, and so that's a little more straightforward. As you look to what does it take to get into NCCN guidelines, or what does it take to get a private payer to cover, that answer can differ, depending on who you're talking to, which payer uses different evidence frameworks or different criteria to evaluate evidence. And so oftentimes your key opinion leaders, your NCCN leaders will say, for us to feel good about putting this in guidelines, we would want to see X, right? And that can be almost impossible, right? Like when I think about our diagnostic portfolio, if it's something like our GeneSight test, looking at clinical outcomes could be a 6-week clinical trial because a patient, undergoes the diagnostic testing, chooses a medication based on that testing, and outcomes might be 6 weeks later. You go back and you see if the patient is feeling less depressed, right? That's a quick, relatively quick clinical trial to do. When I think about our Prolaris test for prostate cancer, doing the test, guiding care, and then seeing if their prostate cancer recurs, that might be a 30-year clinical trial, right? And so, by 30 years, the science will have evolved way past the Prolaris test. So as a company, what do you do in the meantime? Because that the test has a lot of clinical validity, that it can be very helpful in helping men avoid unnecessary treatment for their prostate cancer, but Aetna's not going to cover it until you do a randomized prospective 30-year clinical trial. That's a really difficult place to be. And so I think for Myriad, we've had to continue to evaluate the portfolio, which tests we choose to sell and don't choose to sell, which tests we think we can get reimbursement for, which tests we think we can run a profitable business, right? Knowing that there's always going to be, certain patients, certain indications that are going to be very difficult to get paid for. And so you hope that if you can provide care across the spectrum to all the patients that need that test, that across the spectrum you will be able to make enough money to continue to offer that test to patients. But it's been quite a journey. And that's mostly a US perspective. What have you all found in Europe?
Well, outside of the U.S., the reimbursement landscape and the healthcare environment is very different. So, trying to navigate both sides of that equation, and for European companies to understand the U.S. reimbursement landscape is I think a much longer journey and hard to understand, because the payer system, the healthcare system outside of the U.S. and in Europe is much more straightforward. The way you get your products into large hospitals is very different, and I think in some ways much easier as well. I think the story you have to tell and the adoption of the technology is really the harder part of making your way into the OUS market. When it comes to the way that you, the word is just escaped me, but the RFP process outside of the U.S. is really the heavy process for introducing innovative technology, teaching and educating the hospital, the physicians, the clinical staff on why your product versus another. It's not often that you are talking about price, reimbursement, patient care, whether this is under DRG, which is a much easier pathway in the U.S. When you have patients in the hospital, versus an outpatient model where this discussion about care and standard of care is very different. So you find yourself needing to, it's actually a more fulfilling, I think, discussion, because you are actually having the technical and clinical value discussion more than you are focused on price and how the hospital gets paid and how the patients go through the system and they get reimbursed for all the care. So I think it's an easier discussion outside of the U.S. than it is in the U.S. because the jurisdictional complexity in the U.S. state by state, the different payers, the Medicare, Medicaid structure is you have to have full-time people on staff to keep up and understand how it's moving and how the codes are evolving and what's falling in and out of those codes. So I think it's actually easier.
Yeah, but it does require a full team, to your point. We've had full teams employed that focus on, the private sector, the blues, the government payers, et cetera, what the legal regulations are. There's recently been a series of biomarker laws that I think have been positive with respect to, there's 50 different jurisdictions, but you're starting to see the states take some sort of innovation, and there's some excitement towards these are things that should be paid for. And so that also helps level the playing field, I think, with the different payers to be able to say, in Louisiana, this is the biomarker law, and so the payers should play by these rules. So I think as more people get involved in the diagnostic sort of space in some ways, you have more stakeholders at the table.
Yep.
That helps drive adherence as well.
Yeah, and education on the why this technology versus that technology is actually more powerful for clinical outcomes and patient care and patient results, as opposed to taking this step function or 3 different tests because they fit under the codes and they fit under the reimbursement, and ultimately, days or a week later, you have something that you can go back to the patient and talk about. And that's I think the biggest piece of diagnostics that all companies are struggling with is turnaround time, results, fast results. Patients are, as we said, as consumers and patients, we have an expectation about getting results faster, understanding what treatment looks like in a faster way and in an accurate way. And that is, I think, the evolution, frankly, for a lot of companies, not just infectious disease or cancer diagnostics. There's just an expectation of the patient and the consumer of getting an answer, understanding very clearly what the treatment path looks like, and feeling comfortable and confident with that. We know today, with antigen testing, with other kinds of at-home testing, patients feel more empowered, but they still need a way to have clarity around what treatment looks like. If they get a negative test on an antigen at-home test and they're still sick, they still need a way to understand, and that's what molecular diagnostics has done, is be able to provide a very broad look at, what are the things that could be happening, and not just broad, but fast. And it helps de-escalate antibiotics. And Kelvin talked a little bit, and I talked a little bit this morning about bioMérieux's commitment to AMR and AMS, and this is a real topic in the hospitals and in healthcare today, is really how do you make sure that diagnostics are helping quickly identify and give physicians and clinicians a way to get people on the right drug, the right bug-drug combination, and quickly de-escalate when they are on broad-spectrum antibiotics and they are waiting for tests and results to come back. This is the power of diagnostics in our space, but in a lot of spaces, is making sure that we are doing the right thing with patients and their clinical outcomes, and getting them back out of the hospital, because also the time in hospital is something that is part of all of this, and making sure that you get patients treated, identify what's going on, and out of the hospital, because that's when we start to see other things, hospital-acquired pneumonia and all sorts of other, ancillary issues that come from being in the hospital and being treated on the wrong drugs for an extended period of time.
And this is maybe where regulatory frameworks can help, right?
Yes.
Because I think what was really important for us going through the FDA pathway was going through with our partner AstraZeneca, right? That the drug and the companion diagnostic had been, co-developed and had gone through clinical trials together. And so they went through the FDA pathway together as well. And so that ensures a certain level of quality when a patient or a physician is looking to select that drug, that they know that the testing that their patient is getting was also used in those clinical trials and is going to behave the same way that it did in those clinical trials, right? And that's something that, Myriad has always tried to use as a differentiator, true, as well, right? To be able to say, we have cleared these hurdles, we have done the clinical trials that it takes to make sure that the test performs according to these specifications, and that it will select patients according to this same set of metrics, according to this same cutoff, and physicians and patients can trust that, right? And as there has been an evolution of genetic testing, some companies have gone through that same level of rigor, and some have not, right? And so having a good regulatory framework and also having partnerships, right? Being able to go through the FDA together with AstraZeneca, sort of ensures a certain level of, clarity of
legitimacy.
Yes, exactly, and also clarity of the process, right? AstraZeneca's not going through FDA approval for the first time, right?
Yes.
And so,
Yes.
that helps you get through, and I think also brings that certain level of credibility and trust from our healthcare providers and our patients.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Anything else, Nicole, you would say about getting into diagnostics, operating in diagnostics? Anything else we could share with the audience about our experiences with two really strong and fantastic diagnostics companies?
Yeah. I mean, it's a very rewarding way to spend your career, right? Where you really feel like you make a difference in patient outcomes, and in a way that you can do fairly quickly, right? Like it might take AstraZeneca or Pfizer, many, many, many years to develop a compound from something they find at the laboratory bench all the way through FDA approval and, getting out to patients. And diagnostics is a field that has a lot of innovation, that you can innovate fairly quickly and discover new ways to make our existing therapies much more effective for patients, and really across multiple spectrums of disease. I mean, I've been very fortunate at Myriad to be able to work on, breakthrough companion diagnostics for, ovarian cancer and things in the cancer space, as well as something like mental health, and really understanding how outcomes can be so much better if you just get the patient on the right medication the first time. So it's been an incredibly rewarding way to spend a career. How about for you?
Yeah, well, diagnostics, this is with bioMérieux, this is my first opportunity to be in a diagnostics company. Before that, I spent a lot of time in medical device companies, and that was also very rewarding. But I think the most rewarding part is being able to have patients come and talk about the difference that you made in their outcome or their child's outcome, and tell that story about going back to the hospital multiple times, being treated with multiple antibiotics, and being on cultures, and using technology that took a lot of time and never really gave them the right answer. And that is something that we have really hung our hat on at bioMérieux, is with the BioFire platform, and we have other platforms that are all part of the continuity of bug drug, making sure you've got the right drug for the right bug and identifying it fast and early. But I think being in infectious disease diagnostics, the thing that that gets me up every morning is knowing that we make a difference. We make a difference for people, our neighbors, for people who are very sick and are constantly in the hospital with a variety of ailments, but also hearing the patient's story and hearing those testimonies from patients, from parents, and from providers about the way they have changed the way they manage healthcare and they treat patient and patient outcomes is very rewarding. It's motivating, and it's nice to be able to tell that story and talk about the difference we're making, not in just our local community, but globally, and changing the way that diagnostics is done, and that patient care and what patient care looks like.
Yeah,
So.
and I think you can have an outsized impact as well, not just on day-to-day patient care, but on discovery, drug discovery, and future innovation, right? When I think about PARP inhibitors that AstraZeneca was developing for several years, and it didn't look like they were going to work, and so AstraZeneca had actually shelved that entire drug discovery pipeline, thinking that those drugs didn't work. And as we looked at the mechanism of action, we said, you know, let's go back and look at that cohort again. Let's look at that clinical trial again. Let's test those patients with BRCA testing and see if we can select a patient population where these drugs would work, right? And we were able to do that. And then we were able to enhance that test and find even more patients for which those drugs could be helpful. And you know what we're seeing is a major difference in ovarian cancer, right? Ovarian cancer used to be usually diagnosed stage 4, very poor prognosis. I think it was like 25% of patients would still be alive at 5 years. I mean, it was a really deadly disease. And now you've got an entire class of patients for which this would be a death sentence. And you're able to select those patients, see that PARP inhibitors would be effective for their case, and treat them with the right medication. And there's, I think, you know, to date, there's about 10,000 ovarian cancer patients that would not be alive without a PARP inhibitor, and we wouldn't have PARP inhibitors if it weren't for, you know, the role of a diagnostic being able to choose which patients would actually respond, and that leading to approval of a whole new class of drugs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's exciting. It's very motivating. Well, thank you, Nicole. It's a pleasure to be out here with someone that's had such a
me and for sharing
rich
your story.
Likewise, and also exciting to see so many women, you know, Kate Benedict earlier, and I'm sure she's here somewhere, and, you know, Andrea and Katie Rose, who were just out here, and it's exciting to see more women in the audience and women really being the face of companies, and especially in Utah. That is an evolving and you know, it's an evolution and an evolving dynamic, and I know that I'm sure in your 20 plus years at Genetics, you were a great mentor and helped rise all tides and mentor women and show them what it looked like to be a great leader and to lead from the front. So thank you.
Well. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great, John.
Thank you. Well done.